It was an ordinary summer night, like so many others, but something about that Saturday in July seemed different. The house was silent, without the usual hubbub of the parents' presence. It was the first time I would be alone for so long. The clock was 9:15 p.m. when I threw myself on the couch, finishing watching a movie. The cracking of the letters in the credits made me turn my head, and with my body still lazy, I walked to the kitchen. The air was warm, but not as much as the tension that was building up inside me. It was almost a tradition for me to stay at home when my parents traveled. They had gone to their uncle's house on the coast, and I willingly preferred to spend the days with friends, enjoying the rest of school. Their approving looks always reassured me. A good son who knew how to take care of himself, wash clothes, and prepare food. But that night something seemed to be stirring inside me, as if normal wasn't enough. Something strange was around the house, a feeling of alertness in the air. While I drank the juice in the kitchen, looking out the window, I found myself observing the garden. What was there in the darkness? What seemed empty was actually a blank canvas, waiting for something to emerge. Maybe it was just my mind, tired of a day without major events, but soon something caught my attention. On the other side of the window, where the shadows danced, softly in the wind, a figure appeared. At first, I thought it was the umbrella of the garden, forgotten at the end of a hot afternoon. But as the figure stood there motionless, something inside me became uneasy. It was too late to run to the backyard, so I did what I always do. I watched. The being, if I could call it that, did not move. It was thin, almost ethereal, and so quiet that I couldn't even make it out completely. My heart raced. Something inside me knew that this was not a simple incident. I wanted to go outside and check, but an icy feeling held me back. Then, my phone vibrated, bringing me back to reality with a message from Chris. What could be so urgent at this hour? Maybe it was just an impulse of solitude, a desire to distract myself with the idea of something fun. But the garden, the figure, all this hung over me like a shadow. The sound of my cell phone vibrated again, breaking the tense silence that took over the house. It was a message from Chris. "Hey, how are you? I'm going there now. I want to take a look at that mystery of the garden. I have a flashlight and an idea." I didn't know what to think. On the one hand, Chris's presence could give me the courage I needed to go out and investigate. On the other hand, a strange feeling lingered in my mind, as if I was no longer the same after seeing that figure standing outside in the darkness. Paused for a moment. The garden was there in front of me, quiet and unchanging. But I knew something was different, something I couldn't understand yet, but that was about to change everything. I turned off the kitchen light and hid near the window, watching the figure from afar. Chris sent another message. He was already close. "I'm coming, use the front door. Don't worry, it should be just a shadow, but I'll help you see better." I took a deep breath and went to the door. The house seemed even quieter, more isolated. When I heard the sound of the doorbell, my body shuddered. I opened the door, and there was Chris with his usual energy, ignoring the tension in the air. "Hey, little brother, ready to find out what's going on in your garden?" he asked, with a mischievous smile, but his eyes revealed a hint of worry that he was trying to hide. He quickly entered, gave me a hug, and soon we went to the kitchen, where I showed him the window and the direction of the garden. "I saw something there, Chris, and I don't know, but it seems that it is not just a shadow. Something moved there, and now I have a feeling that we are not alone." Chris looked in the direction I was pointing. "Okay, you think you're just a standing figure, right? It could be the wind or some other reflection. We just need to take a closer look." We got ready to leave. I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't know exactly what was holding me back. "I don't know if I can do it, man. It's like something out there telling me to stay away. But at the same time, I can't ignore it." Chris laughed and grabbed a flashlight from his backpack. "It's Just a garden, man. It will be easy. It will just be a story to tell later. We positioned ourselves at the back door. The night was hot, the humidity filling the air with a stuffy sensation. The light from the lantern illuminated a piece of the porch, but soon disappeared into the darkness of the garden. The wind was calm, and the only thing that broke the silence was the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of some nocturnal animal. "Keep an eye on that part. I'll take a look at the shadows," Chris said, more relaxed than I felt. He walked to the side of the fence where the tallest trees cast dense shadows, almost swallowing any life that passed by. I stood there, watching. He looked at every movement of the tree, at every shadow that formed. Something seemed to be wrong. The darkness seemed denser in a specific point of the garden, as if it was concentrating in a single place. My heart beat faster. "Chris!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Chris, come back here!" He turned around. He was a few meters from me, but the expression on his face was the one I feared. Fear. He looked back toward the fence, and what he saw made his body stretch tense. That's not a reflex," he said, his voice low, barely audible. What we saw looked like a skeletal, almost human figure, but the shape was distorted, as if it had been taken straight out of a nightmare. It didn't move, but it was there, as if it were watching us. Panic began to grow inside me. "What's that, man? What is that?" Chris looked at me wide-eyed. The flashlight flickered in his hand, making the shadows dance around us. I don't know. It doesn't feel right. Let's go back inside." But before we could take a step, the figure moved. Slowly, like a shadow detaching itself from the earth. Her contours began to take shape, a silhouette that stretched, skeletal, too tall to be human. The silence was broken by a scratchy sound, as if something was being dragged on the ground. "Chris, let's get out of here now," I shouted. But the terror left me without the strength to move. My body seemed paralyzed by the sight of what was in front of me. Suddenly, the figure leaned forward, his face distorted in dim light. He had no expression, but her presence made itself felt as if it were approaching us slowly, but with a frightening calm. Chris took my hand and pulled it hard. "Go, Ronnie!" We ran towards the house, but the feeling of being followed tightened. My chest. I would look back, trying to understand if all of this was real or if my mind was playing tricks. But as we ran, the sound of footsteps behind us echoed, stronger and stronger, closer. We arrived at the door. Chris, still trembling, tried to turn the key, but his fingers were too sweaty. "No, no, no, let's go," I shouted, almost breathless. Finally, the door opened. We closed the door behind us with a bang and locked all the locks. Silence took over the house, but the fear did not dissipate. I looked at Chris, and he was as pale as I felt. We breathed heavily as we tried to make sense of what had just happened. What did it all mean? "Chris, did you see what that was?" I still couldn't process what I had seen. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't something that could be explained. What was in the garden was real, and it was still. Outside, watching me, he looked at me but didn't answer. He was as absorbed in his own fear as I was. We looked out the window, trying to see any sign of that figure, but when we looked, there was nothing. The garden was empty, as quiet as before, as if nothing had happened. But somewhere, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever it was still there, and as night came, it seemed that the worst was yet to come. The air inside the house felt heavy, saturated with fear and tension. We were both standing in the living room, the light of the lantern still shining, casting unusual shadows on the walls. The house, normally a place of tranquility, now looked like a prison. Every noise, every crack of the wood made my heart race. But the most disturbing thing was the silence of the night. Nothing but the sound of our breaths. The clock on the wall, which had previously seemed to be a welcoming and routine presence, now gave me a strange feeling, as if it was marking time until something very bad happened. Whatever had followed us to the door was out there, waiting, or perhaps he was already indoors. It was out there, wasn't it? Chris asked, his voice trembling, breaking the silence that hung between us. I looked at him, trying to understand what was going on inside me. There were not enough words to explain what we saw, what we felt. It was as if we had crossed a line. We hadn't just seen something strange, something that couldn't be explained. We had been witnesses to something that did not belong to that place, and that something was still there, lurking, watching us. I don't know, man. I think it was. No, I know I was. I was trying to stay calm, but my voice failed. He could not understand how a simple garden could have become a stage for a night so full of terror. It was as if the world had been turned upside down, and the two of us were the only ones still trying to understand reality. Fear was an invisible force, taking over me, paralyzing me. I knew something wasn't right. I felt it. Every piece of the house felt strange, as if it was no longer mine. The familiarity was slipping away. Everything I knew had been distorted, distanced from what I considered safe. I can't sleep. I can't stay here, man. Something is wrong. I won't be able to stay here alone, I said, almost breathless. Panic was starting to take hold of me. The feeling of being watched, became unbearable. Chris looked just as terrified as I did. His eyes were wide and his breathing was fast. I don't know what to do either. I don't want to go back to the garden. But where? Are we going? What's going on? I looked at him, not knowing what to say. I knew we had to get out of there, but the idea of setting foot outside made me want to go back to the deepest part of the house and lock all the doors and windows. But where would we go? How could we escape something that seemed to be spreading all over the place? It was then that we heard the sound. A low but clear sound, the creak of the back door slowly opening. My whole body twitched. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house moving. The door was opening on its own. No explanation. I looked at Chris, who was already standing, his face pale. He gestured for me to keep quiet. But the fear he was feeling now also took over me. The sound of the door opening mixed with the sound of something else. A low whisper, coming from somewhere outside. There was no way not to hear it. A voice, slow, raspy, as if something was trying to communicate, but without clear words. The syllables shuffled, and the sound seemed to curl up on the walls until it spread throughout the house. "Chris," I began, my voice cracking with fear. Do you hear that?" He nodded but did not speak. His eyes were fixed on the door, as if waiting for it to open completely. And then the worst happened. The back door didn't stop opening. It continued, pushed by an invisible force, until it was completely open. The darkness of the garden seemed to swallow up the light of the house, and the air seemed to become thicker, heavier. I knew we couldn't stay there, but I couldn't move. The dread froze me. It was Chris who acted first. He ran to the door and, without thinking, closed it tightly. The sound of wood hitting the frame echoed through the house, and he locked the door as if that would solve anything. But at that moment, I knew it was too late. Something was there with us, something that wasn't human, wasn't normal, and for the first time I realized that the house in which I felt safe, the garden I used to observe, were now the same places that made me tremble with fear. It was no longer a refuge. It was a prison. I looked at Chris, and I could see that he felt the same way. The fear in his eyes was not disguised. He was as lost as I was. It was as if everything around us was turning into a huge darkness, a silent, evil presence watching us. "Dude, what do we do?" I whispered, throat dry. "We have to get out of here. We have to..." But before I could finish, we heard the sound of something knocking on the kitchen window. A dry sound, as if someone was trying to open the window with brute force. I turned my head to the side, my body chilled with fear. The window was intact, but the sound did not stop. I stood up, hesitantly, and went to the kitchen. Chris was right behind me, flashlight in hand, illuminating the shadows around. Him. When we got to the window, what we saw made me stop completely. It was no longer a shadow. He was no longer the skeletal figure of the garden. It was something much worse. In the darkness, in front of the kitchen window, there was an indistinct shape, a human silhouette. But it was not human. I didn't know how to describe it, but I knew it wasn't something that should be there. The thing seemed to be moving slowly towards us, as if it was feeding on the darkness around it. The light of the lantern did not reveal it completely, but its presence was so dense that it seemed to swallow the light itself. I almost lost control. My body refused to move, my legs weakened, and for a moment I thought it would all end up there, in that dark kitchen, watched by something that no longer belonged to the human world. It was Chris who pulled me back. "We can't stay here, man. We have to leave. Now!" I took a deep breath, still paralyzed by fear. He was right. We had no other choices. We needed to leave, but where? And what would become of that being, of that thing that was now inside the house? What did he want from us? And why was it getting closer and closer? Before I could articulate an answer, we heard another sound, this time coming from upstairs. Steps, heavy, slowly climbing the ladder, one at a time. Chris and I looked at each other. The expression on his face said it all. If that sound was real, it meant we were surrounded. There was nowhere else to run. Silence seemed to be our cruelest enemy. Each sound was amplified by the rising tension, and the only thing I could hear was the beating of my own heart, racing and irregular. Chris was standing next to me, his eyes fixed on the stairs where the footsteps had ceased. The light of the lantern flickered in his hands, but there was nowhere else to escape. Now I knew, if the creature wanted to get us, it didn't matter what we did. She was already inside the house. "We have to act, man. We can't stand still here," I muttered, more to myself than to Chris. He shook his head, his eyes glazed over. "I know, but what can we do? It is not human. None of this is human." These words weighed in the air like a sentence. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Everything we knew, everything we considered normal, was turning to ashes before our eyes. The house was no longer a refuge. The garden was no longer a place of peace. And that figure, who was always one step ahead, was a reminder that what we thought was real was disintegrating. I looked at Chris. His body was tense, his face pale, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He was always the guy who could make a joke to relieve tension, the guy who never hesitated. But now he was just as vulnerable as I was. I knew we had a choice to make. We could keep waiting, let fear consume us until the creature caught up with us, or we could face it without fully understanding what was happening. "I think we have to go all the way, Chris. We have nowhere else to run. We have to face what's up there," he said, trying to find some strength that he didn't know if it still existed in me. He took a deep breath, as if he were preparing for something he knew was inevitable. I looked up at the upper floor of the house, the point where the footsteps came from. He knew the creature was there. She knew that if we didn't do anything, she would take control of everything. But what exactly could we do? "Let's go to the attic. Up there, maybe we can get a gun or something that helps defend ourselves. If we stay here, she'll get us anyway," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady, although the feeling of despair pressed me. Chris didn't immediately respond. He was absorbing every word, weighing the options. But time was against us. We knew that the figure, or the thing, was hunting us, and standing there paralyzed was no longer an option. He finally nodded, and with a swift motion, grabbed the flashlight, and went upstairs. I followed him, but the feeling that something was watching us at every step made the climb more difficult. At each step, my mind screamed for me to stop, but my body didn't want to give in. We needed to go to the attic. There was no other choice. I needed to find something that would give me confidence that we could get out of this situation alive. But what? By the time we reached the top of the stairs, the air was even thicker. Chris's flashlight illuminated the dark hallway, but what scared me most was not the darkness, but the sound of something moving behind us. I turned around, but there was nothing there. I knew what was going on. She was surrounding us. I can't, I whispered, not knowing if I was talking to myself or to Chris. Fear was already taking over me, and my mind was starting to crumble. Chris looked at me intensely, as if he was trying to understand what I was feeling. "You're scared, aren't you?" he asked without a hint of mockery, just a clear observation. I shook my head. "I don't know what to do, Chris. I don't know how to deal with it." He was silent for a moment. "I don't know either. But you know what? We will only find out what to do if we move forward. We won't know until we try. Fear, he won't leave if we don't face him." His words were like a scream inside me. Something moved in my mind. I knew he was right. We couldn't wait for a miracle. We couldn't wait for something that would save us without us doing anything. I needed to get rid of fear. We needed to act. Without saying a word, I began to walk towards the attic. I could feel the weight of fear on my back, but every step I took made me feel a little lighter. I was facing the truth. Fear was never going to go away, but I could overcome it. I could go on, even if I was shaking inside. When we reached the attic door, the flashlight illuminated the rusty lock. I reached out to open it, but an even stronger sense of dread enveloped me. What was up there? What could we find? We didn't know what to expect, but we needed to go all the way. I turned the key, and the door squeaked open, as if the house was protesting our decision. The darkness inside the attic seemed endless, as if it were a place where time did not pass. But there was no more time to hesitate. "Let's go," said Chris, already in front with the flashlight pointed at the dark interior. I took a step forward, feeling the gravity of the decision. This was the moment when there was no turning back. Either we faced it together, or we would fall into the darkness, alone. Every fiber of my body was screaming to give up, but I knew giving up wasn't an option. When we went upstairs and into the attic, I found what we were looking for: tools, a small first aid kit, and even a bowl with candles and matches. But before we could get ready, the sound of a crack coming from the bottom of the house stopped us. Something was moving towards us, something with heavy and calculated steps. Chris held the flashlight more firmly. "Now there is no turning back. We will fight." I knew he was right. We couldn't go back. The moment of overcoming had arrived. Facing the darkness, the creature, or whatever it was the only way. The air was heavy, as if the house itself was watching us, waiting, like a beast about to attack. The attic was quiet, too quiet, and the light of the lantern flickered, as if feeling the weight of fear that hovered in the room. Every breath of mine was harder, tighter. I could feel the panic, the feeling that there was no way out. But at the same time, one thing was clear in my mind. There was no turning back. Chris was next to me, his expression more serious than ever. He knew that this was the moment that would define everything. There were no more secrets. There was no more doubt. Either we faced what was outside, or the house, with all its shadows and secrets, would swallow us up. The attic door was open, and the darkness inside it seemed to stretch like a bottomless abyss. The feeling that something was watching us increased. By the second, and a distant crack of wood made me jump. Someone or something was approaching. Chris looked at me without saying a word. He didn't need to. The fear was there, both of us, and we knew what to do. I raised my head, not knowing how, but with the decision already made. The struggle for survival, for understanding what was happening, was all that was left. "Let's go." "Downstairs," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. "It's here or somewhere else, but we're not going to die here." The fear was there inside me, but something stronger, a flame, a will to fight grew. I got up, tipped the flashlight, and followed Chris to the stairs. When the attic door was closed behind us, the house seemed to take on a new shape. The silence was even more absolute, and the fear more palpable. With each step we took, the sound of footsteps downstairs followed us. It wasn't just steps. They were calculated movements, as if something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to attack. The sound grew louder as they descended the stairs, and the tension in my chest increased. We arrived at the door that led to the lower floor. Every breath I took seemed to be the last before a disaster. The door, once again, creaked. Fear was in every snap, in every move we made. We were about to face whatever was chasing us. "It's almost time," Chris said. His voice trembled, but he wasn't stopping. He was on the move, as if he knew that stopping would be the end. He was my friend, but there at that moment, we were more than friends. We were survivors. We were a single unit. I took a deep breath and pushed the door hard. A loud crack, the sound of the house responding to our challenge. We were downstairs, in the main room. The house looked darker, the shadows longer. Fear was in the air. It was in everything around us. I looked at Chris, who was holding the flashlight tighter now. His eyes were fixed somewhere ahead, but he didn't speak. He also knew that there was something there, that we were not alone. Suddenly, the door to the front room opened with a thud. A loud crack, and a shadow passed quickly through our line of sight. My eyes widened. Fear paralyzed me for a second. I knew what that meant. The creature was there. And it wasn't another game. It was no longer a doubt. It was real, and it was coming towards us. "Chris!" I shouted, my voice broken, but he did not answer. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with silent terror but also unwavering determination. He knew what we had to do. The last thing we could do was run. Or maybe that's exactly what we should do. But before I could make a decision, a figure appeared at the door. It was not a shadow. It was not an illusion. He was a creature, a tall, thin figure, with a distorted head, empty eyes, and a skeletal body. It was there like a wall of darkness, blocking our exit. She stepped forward, and the sound of her feet echoed through the room, reverberating to my bones. I knew we couldn't escape. There would be no escape. I looked at Chris, and our gazes met. There was nothing more to be done. The fight was inevitable. The creature took another step, as if it were approaching slowly, but with a silent force that made it impossible to resist. Fear tightened in my chest, and I felt as if the ground was collapsing beneath my feet. But then something changed. Took a deep breath. The anger, the frustration, the powerlessness, everything inside me turned into a single will, to fight. I wasn't going to let that thing win. I wasn't going to allow them to destroy us. "Chris, grab the blade that's on the shelf, now!" I shouted. I didn't know if he would listen, but I didn't have time to wait. The creature was getting closer and closer. I knew that if we didn't do anything, we would lose. Then, without thinking, I jumped in the direction of the creature. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to do something. Chris, luckily, grabbed the blade and with a scream jumped forward as well. Together, we managed to get close to the creature, who stopped. For a moment, perhaps surprised by our boldness, but it was not enough. The creature stretched out its arms, and its long fingers reached toward us. It was at that moment that I realized that we couldn't defeat her with brute force. We didn't have the necessary strength. We didn't have enough power to fight it in a physical way, but there was something more. Something that would give us the chance we needed. Something that was inside us. Courage. Come on, Chris. I shouted once more before taking the last step, heading towards the creature with all the strength I had. I only knew one thing. We weren't going to go down without a fight. If it were our end, let it be in the last breath, in the last effort. The air was heavy, dense, as if the environment itself was compressed around us. The light of the lantern, already weakened by the growing tension, barely illuminated the room. The sound of our hearts beating was the only thing I could hear, and I was starting to feel like my body couldn't take much longer. The creature in front of us was no longer standing still. She moved slowly. Her every step was calculated, and her presence was so powerful that it seemed to swallow any trace of light. But in the midst of that sweltering darkness, something inside me ignited. A fire, a flame of courage that I didn't know I had. As the creature charged forward, its footsteps echoing through the house as an omen of an impending end, I finally realized the truth. We couldn't run anymore. There was no way out. There was no way out to hide. The only thing left was to fight with everything we had. Chris seemed to have felt the same way. He grabbed the blade, his fingers sweaty but firm. I didn't know if he was more afraid of failure or of the creature itself. But when his eyes met mine, I saw something else there. There was fear, of course, but also a quiet determination, a desire to win, to get out of that situation with our lives. "If we're going to do it, let it be now," he said, his voice deep and full of determination. I didn't know what to expect. The words we exchanged no longer had weight. There was no more time for words. All I knew was that the fight was before us, and we were the last to try to defend it. Move forward. The sound of our movement echoed through the house, drowned out by the pressure of the situation, but every step we took felt as if we were walking on a tightrope, balancing our life on tiptoe. The creature, which had previously seemed motionless, now approached with frightening speed. Her presence was like a heavy burden, and as she approached, the fear became more visible. Her arms outstretched, her fingers long and thin, everything about her seemed predatory. But at the same time, there was a strange lull to her movement, as if she knew it was inevitable. "Let's go," I shouted, trying to expel the fear, trying to take control of the situation. Chris and I were a team. Nothing else mattered. We knew that the only chance to survive was if the two of us were together, acting in sync. As the creature stretched out its hands toward us, I stepped forward, raising the blade with all the force I could muster. The blade cut through the air, but instead of hitting the creature, it pierced through it as if it were nothing more than a passing shadow. I froze, eyes wide. The blade, which had once seemed like our only chance, was now useless. The creature was becoming even more imposing, growing in size, its eyes reflecting pure malice, an essence that could not be explained by words. It was at that moment, at the very moment when the blade passed without effect, that the truth struck me with all its force. We could not defeat it with weapons. There wasn't enough physical strength in the world to fight what she was. What we needed was something deeper, something that was beyond fear, beyond the blade, beyond brute force. Chris, noticing the same, made an unexpected move. Instead of trying again with the blade, he threw it away and took a step forward, raising his hands, as if asking for something, asking for an answer. "I'm not going to fight you," he said, his voice quiet but full of a confidence I couldn't understand. "I'm not going to let fear control me. I will not let you make us your slaves." The creature paused for a moment, as if evaluating Chris's words. Her eyes, once fierce, were now more distant, as if something had touched her. I was about to speak, to ask him what he was trying to do, but before any words came out, there was a deep silence. The creature slowly began to retreat, its footsteps echoing through the room, softly, as if it were retreating from something it could no longer touch. I didn't understand. How was this possible? How had Chris managed to do something so impossible? But then I realized, as the creature disappeared into the shadows, that what Chris had done wasn't just an act of courage. He had defied his own fear. He had broken the chains that bound us to it, and somehow that was enough. It was enough to drive the creature away, to give us a chance at survival. "Chris," I spoke, my voice trembling, still not believing what had just happened. He turned to me with a slight but tired smile. "We did it," he said. "Not the creature, us." And at that moment, something inside me also changed. I'd become a different person, someone who had faced his greatest fears and, more importantly, someone who had learned that the greatest strength came from within, not from weapons, not from physical struggle. I had learned that the real battle was against fear, against doubt, and the victory was not in destroying the creature, but in destroying what it represented within me. I looked around, and the house, which had once seemed so full of darkness and threats, was now silent. The light from the lantern illuminated the room softly, as if somehow peace had returned to the place. We knew we couldn't go back to our normal life before, but at that moment, it was as if we had been freed from something greater. The house, the creature, all that was part of a cycle that was now coming to an end. We sat down exhausted but relieved. Fear had been replaced by a new understanding, a new way of seeing the world. We knew that despite everything, we were stronger than we thought. That fear, that feeling of helplessness, had been dispelled, and now we were free to move on. Chris looked at me, and for a moment there was silence. It was no longer the silence of before, the heavy silence of an endless weight, but a quiet silence, like that of someone who had known that he had fulfilled his destiny. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, almost as if a confirmation that everything was somehow right now. I smiled, a real smile, though still tired. "Yes, I am. What about you?" "Also," he replied, "I think we can sleep now." We both laughed, but we knew it wouldn't be the same anymore. We would no longer be the same people. What we faced changed us, and somehow it made us stronger, more capable, more aware that the greatest challenge will never be what is out there, but what is inside us.